Welcome to the WattSherpa podcast, your guide to energy efficiency and savings.
Okay, so Dr. Winterich, thanks so much for joining me for WattSherpa's interview series. For people who don't know, I'm building WattSherpa to help guide consumers on how they can start to adopt more clean energy practices and save money in the process. And as I started researching consumer behavior and sustainable consumption, I came across the work of Dr. Karen Winterich, who I'm very excited to have as a guest today. She's an expert on consumer behavior. Her research examines how consumer social identities influence charitable giving as well as sustainable behavior. She's been published in the Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Marketing Research, and Journal of Marketing, among others. She serves as a co-editor for the Journal of Marketing Research and is president of the Academic Council of the American Marketing Association. And additionally, she is a teacher at the Penn State Susman College of Business, where she teaches classes on sustainability marketing and consumer behavior. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. I was just hoping to just run through a couple questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Carter. I'm happy to chat with you, and it's real exciting, inspiring, and hopeful to see younger students like yourself being motivated to help try to address some of the environmental challenges we're facing.
Got it. So the first question I have is just generally, what originally sparked your interest in sustainability and consumer behavior?
Yeah, so I really didn't have a traditional path per se or any like one moment for me. I was doing a lot of my research in more pro-social behavior in terms of like donations, which is not really in and of itself. But then at the Susman College of Business at Penn State, we really wanted to offer more options to our students to become more educated about sustainability, particularly in sustainable business practices, influencing consumers to be more sustainable. And so I was asked to develop a course on sustainability marketing. It was really my existing research interest, the very broad pro-social realm, and then the teaching, really digging into developing a course on sustainability marketing that led me to have so many questions and become so interested in the developing field of sustainability marketing. And then I just took off. And now I think about it all the time.
Yeah, so that actually perfectly flows into my next question about how your role at Penn State and student interest in sustainability there has shifted over time, especially like you said, since you've developed this.
So yeah, I started teaching this about 10 years ago, or developed it really a little over 10 years ago. And there has been a pretty large shift. And I tell my students, they probably get sick of hearing me say, this is great because 10 years ago, this was the response. And now you're responding this way. This is so much progress. But there's definitely been progress, which is great. One of the questions I used to ask my students, like in the first week of class, was, is sustainability marketing an oxymoron? Like, why do we even have a class on sustainability marketing? Because we think traditional marketing is just like selling people stuff they don't need. And that really does not jive very well with sustainability. And that's like the opposite, right? And we had a really big discussion when I asked that question about 10 years ago in class. And now I ask that, and they just look at me like, why would you ask that? Obviously, we need a class on sustainability marketing. Of course, it makes sense, right? That's great because we've come so far that they get how critical it is. They get that it's important and that it does make sense, that business marketing can be sustainable or at least make strides in that direction. We've certainly seen a big change, both in their general kind of awareness and interest, I think also in their attitudes towards it. So that's really hopeful.
Yeah, and as someone of Gen Z and nowadays, I totally agree that a lot of my family more focus on sustainability and think about it more as, I'd say, like a standard rather than something like outside of that. So would you say that you've seen this kind of shift throughout like society as a general, or is it more the younger generation that seems to be pushing this forward?
That's a great question. And the research is a little bit, I would say mixed, but we can see different pieces. And often what the media likes to pick up in headline is not really the full story. It's what gets the most clicks, which is their often motivation. But I think it is great because I think the younger generation, Gen Z, you've heard about it all your life, right? And so it's, to some extent, all you've ever known, which is fantastic, right? There is another option to you besides caring about the environment. And that's a great position to be in. But at the same time, I would say there are a lot of, so what we've seen in the research is that the younger generation is pro attitude, but their behaviors aren't really matching. So it's like, yeah, I care about this. But when it comes right down to choosing, am I going to buy fast fashion or not? I'm going to buy the fast fashion because that's what everyone else is doing, right? So I have positive attitudes and actions, positive attitudes, but my actions may not align entirely. Whereas it may not be that there's an overarching positive attitude across different segments in older generation, but there are some older generation, we can say the boomers if we want, that there are some segments in there that are really active. They are driving movements. Some of them are retired and they are activists and they're having the garden at home and they're composting and they're putting the solar panels in and they're reducing their energy use and they're not driving as much. So they're really trying to actually live the life in addition to having the attitude. So I think that's where we see this kind of attitude to action or gap happening. And that it happens not just in sustainability, it happens in attitudes towards nutrition and health. And then we eat the burger and fries. Still, it doesn't just happen in sustainability. It happens in a lot of other kind of areas where it's hard to act the way we have a positive attitude towards. So I just want to give credit to older generations that are really active in making things happen. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of hope and inspiration from just having the awareness and the attitudes at the younger generation. And hopefully that will lead into a lot more meaningful impact when they have the knowledge and the ability to do so.
And I think that kind of ties into my next question. It's kind of two parts. In one, that it's almost, have you seen a big shift in marketing, in brand dollars moving towards messaging about sustainable practices? And additionally, are the marketers that are doing this seeing real returns on the investment? Talk about people are obviously in favor of sustainability, but if they're not really acting on it, are these people actually getting returns on their investment for marketing around sustainability?
Yeah, great question. Certainly, we've definitely seen a shift in the amount of messaging or the brand dollars spent on messaging about all sorts of practices, the attributes of a given product, the materials it's made with, or how to dispose of it, whatever is sustainable. Or also, with sustainability, we think about it very broadly beyond the environment, but also the social. So we see a lot of kind of social attributes that we pay our workers fair wages. What is the kind of the well-being, looking at our supply chain and taking care of that. Both these environmental and social aspects we see being marketed, promoted by brands. Yes, that's beneficial. So we do see there's some research out of the Stern School, NYU, that shows the fastest growing brands are those that are sustainable. So we definitely can say, yes, it's paying off to be a sustainable brand. But I want to caution that with just the messaging alone, which I think you're alluding to, is not enough, right? Consumers are getting smarter. They're doing their homework. There's a plethora of information out there. And if you're just saying it as a brand and you're not acting it, you are very likely to get called out. And of course, with more information being out there, more companies trying to promote sustainability in some way, shape, or form in their product or services, there's also greater skepticism that all of this can't be true, right? So consumers are widely looking at this and worry about greenwashing, right? Which is this misleading, companies being misleading us and how sustainable a product is. There's also a new practice called green hushing, a little bit the opposite of greenwashing, right? Companies are putting their information out there and consumers are like, not so sure I believe that, right? You're misleading me. To the extent now we've gone the reverse direction where some companies are purposefully not sharing any information about their sustainability practices. So the green hushing, like keeping it quiet. And that kind of comes to this idea of I'm probably going to get attacked, right? Whether it's I'm not doing enough or maybe some investors won't even like it, even though we definitely have a large call in the finance area, right? BlackRock, look, you must be thinking about the ESGs. This is really important. But also, that's not for everybody, right? It's been very politicized, unfortunately. And there might be some investors that say, I don't want to support your company if you tell me you're doing these green initiatives. So it goes both ways. Definitely an increase. Those brands are growing, and that's great. But some companies are still hesitant because of all the backlash they can get. And consumers are also very skeptical. And I can't say that they're wrong to be skeptical. Yeah.
I think that just really goes to show like how important your research is, and people like you are helping promote sustainable marketing. And just like a question kind of adding on to that, in order to prevent these kind of negative side effects, I could say, what are some of the most successful ways that you have seen like consumers influence to drive behavior that's beneficial to their communities, whether branding or other activities?
Yeah. So I think in terms of like actually driving behavior to be more sustainable, I did a lot of work before and I still do some on like identity, how we see ourselves as a person with our self concept, very psychology based. And really, when we think about who do we identify with, how do we see ourselves, who do we want to see ourselves as becoming? If you can get like identity to come into play, right? That the person that's being sustainable is someone I identify with, that I'm much more motivated to act that same way. And so that ties in really well to the idea of social influence, which is another really powerful way to get people to change behavior. We see this a lot for Gen Z, but other generations as well, into TikTok, right? And then any sort of influencers, micro influencers online, as abundant as they are, and they're not all that effective. There are some. If you can get a small segment, we found that micro influencers, those have relatively fewer followers, not millions and millions, they are more influential because they really drive this more kind of powerful connection in terms of a uniqueness and identification factor, but then they can drive that social influence. But it doesn't have to be the scale of a TikTok influencer. It can be someone that is just in your community, right? It could be the star of the school, whoever's the popular kid per se. If they start doing something sustainable, if they're like, hey, I'm not driving to school anymore because I'm taking public transportation, or I'm going to ride my bike because I care about the environment. Suddenly, it becomes a lot cooler, in essence, for everybody else to also not drive their own car to school, right? And so thinking about using that social influence, that power of we want to follow the crowd for the most part, right? And oftentimes that might be for worse, but it can also be used for better. And so thinking about how can we use that really powerful social influence to drive people to be more sustainable. That's one of the most powerful ways to drive people to be more sustainable.
And this is actually really interesting for me to hear, not just for WattSherpa, but on a personal level, because actually right now I'm working on a project in my community to spread the adoption of this app called Grid Rewards that encourages people to reduce their energy usage during times of peak usage. And families can actually make about $100 a year for just turning down their AC just a couple times a year. And right now I'm in the process of trying to market the app through different student clubs and schools across my region, with prizes available for groups that have the most downloads. So just generally, I know you just talked about this, but what advice would you give us to make our campaign as effective as possible in terms of messaging and who to partner with and different incentives?
Yeah, great question. And there's lots of different factors that at play, and they can be used together too. I think it sounds like you're trying to make a competition, right? Giving some prizes out. And that's really a great way to do it. If we just keep harping on people like, be more sustainable, right? Save the environment, that gets old. We feel like we can't do enough to help, and it's meaningless. And in the scale of one person, I'm not saying that it is meaningless in the scale of one person, but we start to feel that way. And so I think the idea of let's make this a group effort. Let's make it fun and competitive is a fantastic way to do that, where you're getting that kind of social influence, right? I want to help my team. I want to help my organization. I think that should be really strong in trying to get groups of people to engage together. And maybe if there's even some way to track who's in the lead or who's doing it more often. And if it's not just one, you could do it certainly one to one. But if you do it like my group versus your group, my organization, my neighborhood, and then people want to one up and no, I got to get better. I got to beat this one. That makes it fun and drives it. And you don't just feel like, oh gosh, if I don't do this, I'm a bad person. But you actually want to do it because it's fun and engaging. And that's that social factor that's at play. I think in terms of the messaging you use, besides help your team, help your group, like making it more fun, is why should people want to do this? And of course, there's many reasons for that. But think about who are you targeting? Are they really going to care more about saving the money? Like the $100 that I might be able to save? Or is it more about they really care about the environment, right? Or is there some other reason that they might want to do it? And keeping things as local as possible in terms of the benefit. So we don't want to turn down our AC to save the polar bears. That just seems really distant, right? But maybe we're seeing increasing temperatures, a lot more hot days in Philly. And so we want to make sure that we're not seeing that increase in climate in our own area. Maybe it's about pollution, right? What matters to the people you want to change behavior? and then using that in the messaging. And it might be saving money. What else to do with that $100, right? So maybe that's the motivational factor that you want to play into. But I think that social influence, the competition, the fun, and not just making them feel guilty. Guiltiness, making people guilty really doesn't tend to drive that much behavior. So I think that you've got a good approach there.
Got it. Yeah. And it's really interesting how you talk about the different approaches you can take, whether there are some people who are truly dedicated to sustainability in the environment. Obviously, I feel like everyone should be, but that's unfortunately not the case in reality. And how you can also take the approach of like financial incentives and how it's like they can work together, but it's also almost, there are sometimes I feel like competing against each other for which one should take priority. And I just think that is very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Because financial incentives, we do tend to go towards those. And I think it's even interesting the way you might be setting up as like a prize versus a direct incentive. So we see sometimes incentives work, financial incentives work, but often very short term. When you take them away, people go back to the old behavior unless it's already been formed into a habit. So they're not necessarily, and sometimes it takes away that intrinsic motivation. Like you're saying, people are really motivated to help the environment anyway. You pay them for it. They're like, oh, well, am I doing this because I care? Or am I doing it for the money? And then I'm like, I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. So they can have negative effects, but I think doing it more as like a prize and a reward as opposed to a direct connection all the time might help get away from some of the limitations of financial incentives. What you don't want to do is set it up where it's actually people are trying to skirt the issue. So they're like, well, what I'm going to do is turn down my AC during this time, but then to make up for it, I'm going to crank it up really high on the off-peak hours when I'm not being monitored or something, depending with I don't know exactly how it's set up for you. But oftentimes when there are financial incentives directly tied to the behavior, people will do the behavior per se, but it looks like the behavior to get the reward, but they'll find a way around it, like an unintended consequence. There's actually a really classic study on this, or not really a study, but it happened in the field. In Canada, they had people paying per weight of their trash at their residential area. And people, they want to pay. So they started taking their trash to public trash cans. And then they had public trash receptacles, trash cans downtown, like overflowing with household trash. Now, technically that was illegal to put household trash in but people didn't care. They were trying to avoid the disincentive of paying more of trash per pound. So people tried to save the money, but they found a way around it, which caused additional headaches for the local municipality to take care of all this household trash that was in public trash receptacles that shouldn't have been there. So I want to be careful of that perverse incentives effect.
Got it. Like shifting more towards your research and more about you, as I was researching before this interview, I saw that your most recent publication was titled Knowledge Gaps and Sources of Bias in Consumer Beliefs and Effective Marketplace Actions to Mitigate Climate Change. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about the key findings from that publication?
Sure. I'm glad you asked because I really love it. I think it's important. And we basically find that people want to make a difference on average, particularly those that really want to make a difference, but we don't know what makes a meaningful impact. And so we ask people, we ask college students, we ask just online participants, we actually asked a variety of experts. And we found that what experts say really matters does not tend to align with what the layperson, right? The students, just online adults, things like that. Because we hear things like recycling, and that's really accessible to us. But it's really not cutting down our carbon emissions very much on average, right? We think like planting trees is going to be a great thing to do. And it is a good thing to do, but it doesn't offset all the other things, such as taking a cross-country or transatlantic flight, right? So those have huge emissions. But we can't say, I recycle my cans, so it's okay for me to fly. They just don't equate to each other in terms of the magnitude of savings that we have. But we tend to think within category. Oh, okay, using this sustainable cleaner is better than using this non-sustainable cleaner, so I'm a sustainable person. But I'm still going to eat lots of animal products, and I'm going to fly multiple times a year. I'm going to drive by SUV, that's a gas guzzling vehicle, and I'm going to not with the number of trips per mile. Like all of those things are magnitudes higher in terms of emission impact than recycling and not printing and those little kind of buying less clothes. Like those things we just think that buying sustainable goods and doing like little sustainable things are making us sustainable and helping really drive, but they're not having a meaningful impact. We need to make these bigger which are harder behaviors. They're less accessible to us, right? It's harder to buy less than it is to just buy more sustainable, but we're still buying and that's still having a negative impact. And then the other big piece I want to highlight from there is really trying to not just focus on the individual change, but collectively pushing for system change, right? So there's a lot of reasons why we fly and buy more and do these behaviors that are not sustainable, but we have to have the infrastructure in place to have things change at like the system level, right? So we have EV charging stations in maybe some large cities, but then there's electric vehicle deserts where there are just not charging stations and it's not possible to have an electric vehicle. And so we can't say, hey, here's an incentive to buy an electric vehicle. Also, you won't be able to charge it. Like, it just doesn't go hand in hand, right? So we have to think at the big picture, how the system works. We can't tell people to bike, but have no safe bike lanes because no one's going to bike if it risks their life, right? So we have to think about how does everything work together at the big picture, at the system level, before we start to be able to have meaningful behaviors changing. If that makes sense.
Yep, that makes it's really interesting. Relation to your studies, I somewhat recently, you let me participate in a coding exercise for a current study that you're working on right now around consumer behavior and refurbished goods. Do you want to share more about kind of the process of this type of study, as well as how you make decisions on topics you're going to study and what steps are taken in order to execute?
Yeah, I could go on and on for that. So I'll try to keep it short. Thank you for your help in coding some of the research that I was working on. And that was part of a project that is ongoing and has been actually for several years, the project as a whole, because often our research takes many years to develop from idea generation into the actual data collection and the publication process. But that was looking at repair behavior. And so a question we had was, we were talking in this project about whether a company offers repairs and how that might signal to customers that it's more like worth repairing a product if the company is actually offering the repair. Even if they pay for it, even if the consumer pays for it, it's still like a signal that, hey, if the company says it's worth repairing, it must be worth repairing. But someone had asked us if refurbished, just seeing that products are refurbished, does that also signal that it must be worth repairing products because you can refurbish them? And we thought that made sense. We're like, yeah, probably. But it didn't work. We didn't find that having refurbished product by the brand increased repair. And so what you actually worked on for us is because our inference, our assumption was that consumers thought refurbished products were broken products that were repaired. But we actually found, thanks to some of your coding, we asked open-ended where they think these products come from. It turns out that only about 10, 11% of people think that refurbished products are broken and then repaired. Most of them are just perceived to be like returns that are still fine, people just don't want them anymore, but that they weren't actually broken and then repaired. So without that kind of consumer psychology, without that thinking of the process, we don't get the effect. So what we try to do is understand like little nuances and what are consumers thinking? What are they assuming? What are they inferring? And then how does that impact their choices, their decisions down the road? So I try to think about things that I think are really meaningful and relevant, like right now. We see this repair movement happening, which led to this project, and we see refurbished products coming out more and more companies trying to refurbish their products, having secondhand type of, not necessarily secondhand, but used goods marketplaces, whether that's from refurbished or just simply used secondhand from other consumers. We see that happening. So I try to do things that are pretty topical. And then, of course, I'm interested in the sustainability aspect. So that's where that comes around. Yeah.
Got it. And then just for my last question, what would you recommend to students like myself with an interest in the field of sustainability? And what path do you think we should be taking just in terms of education and anything else that would help drive the most impact?
Yeah, I just definitely getting active speaking. Catherine Hayhoe is one of the leading climate scientists, and she talks about how important it is to just have the conversation. I think students like yourself, a Gen Z, if you care about the environment, have the conversation, talk to other people about it, other peers, because it's not necessarily everyone, even though you are Gen Z, not everyone is on the same page as you or cares as much as you do, but also talk to your parents, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, right? Top of line, try to have the conversation. And when you're having that, try to tie back the importance as locally as you can, right? What is the local impact? Why does it matter for your area right here, right now? In Pennsylvania, I say Lyme disease, increasing number of ticks. So hunters might really care about this. Any outdoorsy person might really care about this, right? People that have their dogs outside might care about this. So this applies to so many different groups of people with different interests. What's it to do with climate change, right? Well, the climate change right here, because we're having fewer colder, really cold days. So we don't see the tick population dying off, right? It's lasting much longer into the winter, starting up earlier in the spring. And so we see a growth in the number of ticks with deer-borne illness or deer ticks with illness, and we see an increase in Lyme disease. And that is climate change right here in Pennsylvania that I think a lot of people care about. So if you can say we care about it for California or some other far away, California's not that far away, but relatively speaking, not some other here, right here, locally, right now. Why do we care? Have that conversation. But I think just also to answer your question about education, I would say we still need this generation to have their own core skill, right? So we don't want everyone to just become a sustainability major in essence, right? And be an expert in all things sustainability. That's not going to happen. Get your core skill base. And maybe that's education. Maybe that's an engineer. Maybe that's in business, right? Are you going to be an accountant? Okay, but how do you also account for the environmental costs and the emissions? If it's your education, you're a teacher, how do you bring that into the classroom? How do you bring that into the discussions that you're having with this next generation, right? If you're an engineer, how do you think about the environmental impacts of whatever it is that you're designing, right? Is it houses? What's the erosion? What's the impacts? I think what we want to do is have this generation continue education in a core skill area. But then as they go out into the workforce, implement their skill set with this additional knowledge of what is the impact of the choices that we're making on the environment, on society, right? And so not thinking siloed of, I just design things. I don't care about what the impact is on the environment, right? I just teach students the ABCs and math. I don't care about their value. I just teach. You want to broaden things out and say, my colleague Eric Foley used to talk about a T, where the base of the T is the core skill base, right? We still need that foundational knowledge. But then the top of the T is like thinking with a sustainability lens, making decisions by considering the sustainability impacts in addition to all the other factors. So if that makes sense, if that kind of helps, but just having the sustainability lens infiltrate all of our decision-making, weighing those factors in our decisions as opposed to ignoring them will be a huge step forward for society.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I feel as I do more and more research, I see more and more how sustainability is going to seep into all aspects of society going forward. And as you're talking about local impact, we're just continuing to see more effects. Hopefully help push more people towards recognizing, like you said, the need of the sustainability lens over everything. Thank you so much for coming on. All the research you're doing and everything you told me today is extremely interesting and I think super important for everyone to be able to hear. And I just wanted to thank you one more time for being on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Great to chat with you. Thanks for all you're doing in the fight.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed our podcast, please like and subscribe and visit us at WattSherpa.com.